Folks around Madison County still whisper about that cabin on the ridge. They say if the wind's right, you can hear crying drifting through the trees. Back in 1895, a midwife named Eliza Durnall helped bring half the county's children into this world and quietly sent others out of it. When a sheriff pried up her floorboards, what he found changed this valley forever. Stay with me till the end. And don't forget to subscribe for more forgotten stories buried deep in American soil. The Ozarks in 1895 were a world of their own. Hills rolled on forever, green in summer, gray in winter, and air always smelled like wood smoke, wet earth, and wild mint. Families lived miles apart, connected by little more than dirt roads and Sunday church bells. Life wasn't easy here. Folks depended on the land and on each other. When a baby came or a sickness struck, there wasn't always a doctor to call. Just one woman everyone knew, Eliza Durnall, the midwife of Madison County. Eliza had been helping bring children into this world for nearly 20 years. She was born just after the Civil War, down near the White River, and grew up watching her mother, a quiet woman who knew herbs better than any doctor. From her, Eliza learned what the forest could heal: willow bark for fever, sassafras for pain, mint for nerves, and a prayer for everything else. She married young, to a logger named Samuel Durnall. They built a small cabin together, 2 rooms and a porch that leaned toward the creek. For a while, they were happy. But one winter, Samuel was killed when a tree split wrong and crushed him beneath the snow. Eliza buried him herself behind the cabin, and after that, she didn't laugh much. Still, she carried on her work. Folks said she was the best midwife the county ever had. She'd travel through storms, through floods, through nights so dark you could barely see your hand in front of you, all to help someone in need. She never asked for money. People paid her with milk, or eggs, or quilts stitched with love. Everyone respected her, and yet there was always something about her that made people uneasy. Maybe it was her eyes, pale, almost colorless, like the river stones that lined the creek. Maybe it was her stillness. She could stand in a doorway without a sound, like she'd been there all along. The children in town used to whisper that she could see through you. The adults never said it out loud, but many believed it too. Eliza's cabin was simple but tidy. Inside, jars lined every shelf, filled with herbs, powders, oils, and other things no one dared ask about. The air always smelled of vinegar and lavender. Her tools, scissors, linen, a Bible worn to thin pages, stayed in a small wooden case she carried everywhere. She rarely came into town except for supplies, and when she did, people greeted her with polite smiles but watched her closely. She'd nod, say little, then head back up the ridge before sundown. Still, folks owed her too much to ever question her ways. She delivered their babies, nursed their sick, and sat by their dying. When she passed by, men tipped their hats and women lowered their eyes. But when night came and the lamps burned low, that's when the talk began. Some said she spoke to the creek after dark. Others swore they saw her light moving through the trees long after midnight. A hunter once claimed he saw her digging behind her cabin by lantern light, humming some tune he didn't recognize. The next morning, he told his wife, "I don't reckon I saw nothing at all," and he never brought it up again. The people of the Ozarks had lived through droughts, fevers, and war. They knew not to poke at what the mountains wanted to keep to themselves. So they let her be. They told themselves she was just old, lonely, and odd in her ways. But by the first frost of 1894, some had started to notice strange things. A woman from the next valley overcame to Eliza for help with her pregnancy and never returned. A peddler who sold ribbons and combs stopped at her place during a storm and was never seen again. Neighbors tried not to look too closely when smoke rose from her chimney late at night. They said, "She's mixing her herbs." But deep down they wondered, what else might she be doing alone up there? Still, no one dared accuse her. You don't turn against the woman who's delivered your children. You don't question the only midwife for 50 miles. In those hills, trust wasn't a choice, it was survival. And maybe that's why no one saw the darkness coming until it was too late. It started quietly, the way most dark things do. The spring of 1895 had come late that year, and the White River was high from rain. The hills smelled of mud and honeysuckle, and folks were just starting to come out from their winter shut-in. Then a man rode into town, his coat soaked through, asking after his wife, Clara Tinsley. She'd gone to see Eliza Durnell 2 days before. Her pregnancy had turned rough, and she was bleeding bad. She'd packed a small basket, some bread, lard, and a little wooden cross she'd carved herself. She told her husband she'd be back by Sunday. She never came home. Eliza told the husband that Clara had left early, said she'd gone east to stay with her mother. The man thanked her and rode off. But when he reached Springfield, he found Clara's mother had been dead for 3 years. He came back shaking, eyes hollow. "She lied to me," he told Sheriff Harlan Boyd. She lied. The sheriff was a hard man, had fought through the last years of the war and seen what people could do to each other. He wasn't one to believe in rumors. But that look in the husband's eyes unsettled him. Still, without proof, what could he do? Eliza had been the midwife for half the county. Everyone owed her something. To accuse her would be like accusing the hills themselves. A few weeks later, a peddler passed through, the kind who sold ribbons, combs, and sewing needles from a mule cart. He stopped by the Durnell place during a thunderstorm. Folks saw his cart the next morning, sitting empty on the road, the mule still tied to a fence post. The man was gone, probably drowned in the creek, the blacksmith said. These storms take men all the time. But deep down, people knew storms didn't take this many, not from the same ridge. By midsummer, 3 more names had joined the whispers: a hired hand from down by the mill, a young widow, and the preacher's niece who'd gone to fetch medicine for her fevered mother. None of them made it home. In a town that small, you notice who's missing. Church benches sat emptier. Front porches went quiet. Mothers started keeping their children closer, and men carried lanterns on their way to the barn after sundown. One boy claimed he saw Eliza digging behind her cabin at night. She was humming, he told his father. Digging and humming. His father told him to hush and not to go near that ridge again. A few months later, the preacher's wife found a bonnet tangled in the brush near the trail that led to Eliza's house. White with little blue flowers, the kind Clara Tinsley used to wear. She took it to the sheriff. That evening, Boyd rode up to the cabin. He found Eliza sitting by the fire, calm as ever. "You've been hearing things," she said before he even asked. "Maybe," he replied. "Maybe I've been hearing too much." She poured him tea and smiled faintly. "You think I hurt those people?" "I think a lot of people are scared," he said. Her eyes stayed on him. "Fear don't make a thing true, Sheriff. This land breeds ghosts in people's heads." He left with nothing but more questions. But as he stepped out, he glanced toward the back room and noticed a folded sheet of linen on the table, red stains not yet turned brown. "Blood from the birthing bed," she said quietly. "Some stains never wash out." He nodded and left, though his gut told him something was wrong. That night, he sat by the creek and listened. He could hear faint sounds echoing off the ridge, like voices carried on the wind. He told himself it was just water moving over rock, but the sound didn't fade. Days turned into weeks, and more people went missing. Still, the sheriff found no proof, and folks tried to live their lives as if nothing was wrong. They told themselves the world had always been cruel. People vanished in the mountains every year. But not like this. Not one after another. Then came Thomas Redding, a drifter passing through from Arkansas. He stopped by the general store one morning, asking if the midwife still took guests. Said he'd heard she offered a warm meal and a roof if you did a little work. The storekeeper frowned. "Ain't wise to head that way after dark," he said. The man laughed, bought a tin of coffee, and left before noon. His hat was found days later by the creek, tangled in the roots. His body never was. That was the moment the whispers turned into fear. No one wanted to say her name, but everyone knew it. Women began crossing themselves when they passed the old trail. The preacher started preaching about the devil wearing familiar faces. The Ozarks had seen floods, fevers, and killings before, but not this kind of fear. This was something quieter, heavier, a dread that settled into the bones of every man, woman, and child. Still, no one confronted her. Not yet. Not the sheriff. Not the preacher. Not a soul. Eliza Durnell had delivered their children and buried their dead. She was part of the hills themselves, and folks had learned never to go digging too deep in this land. But late that November, as cold winds howled down the valley, someone saw smoke rising from her cabin again, brighter, wilder, higher than before. At first, they thought it was her chimney. But before the night was over, the sky above the ridge was glowing red. And by morning, Madison County would never be the same again. By the time winter rolled into the Ozarks that year, folks said the valley felt wrong. Nights seemed longer. The fog stayed late into the mornings. Even the dogs barked less. The air felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to happen. The talk about Eliza Durnall had turned from worry to fear. Nobody said her name loud anymore. They called her the woman up on the ridge or her from the creek. Everyone knew who they meant. It started in whispers, over coffee, over fence rails at church doors. "She's been digging again," someone said. "Saw her out past the oak grove with a lantern," another added. "Maybe she's just tending her herbs." In the middle of the night, and that's when the room would go quiet. The preacher, Reverend Amos Hale, tried to settle folks down, but his sermons started to sound more like warnings. "Evil wears familiar faces," he said one Sunday, his voice trembling slightly. "Sometimes it comes smiling. Sometimes it comes to help." Everyone knew who he meant, even if he didn't say her name. The next morning, someone left a little bundle of salt and sage on the church steps. A mountain charm meant to keep bad spirits away. That's when people realized the fear wasn't just talk anymore. It was spreading. A few families packed up and left. They said they were visiting kin for the winter, but everyone knew they weren't coming back till the valley felt safe again. Sheriff Harlan Boyd was restless. He'd gone up to the cabin twice since the peddler and the farmhand vanished, each time coming back with nothing but more questions. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was right under his feet, but he couldn't dig without proof. One evening, as the light faded, he rode down to the blacksmith shop. "If she's guilty," the sheriff said, "she hides it better than the devil himself." The blacksmith didn't look up from his work. "Then maybe the Lord don't want us finding it," he said. After that, neither man said another word. But strange things started to happen that winter. A low humming was heard some nights, soft at first, like someone singing far away. It would rise and fall with the wind, always near the ridge. The older folks said it was just the trees bending, but children whispered that it sounded like a woman's voice. Then came the thumping. Just before dawn, people living near the creek swore they heard it, steady, hollow, like someone hammering into the ground. When they went to look, there were no tracks, just frost. Then one morning, Martha Redding, the wife of the missing drifter, found something strange on her porch. Her husband's pocket watch, the same one she'd thrown into the river weeks earlier in her grief. It was clean, still ticking. The time was wrong, but it ticked all the same. When she showed the sheriff, he turned it over in his hands. "I think," he said softly, "it's time we dig." But digging wasn't easy out here. The Ozarks weren't like the cities. There were no judges, no papers to sign, no law except what a man could live with. And nobody wanted to be the one to strike a shovel into that woman's ground. They were torn between two fears, the fear of being wrong and the fear of being right. And while they hesitated, the fear grew. When Eliza came to town now, people stepped out of her way. She'd walk past the general store, her shawl pulled tight, eyes forward. The talk would stop till she was gone. Nobody dared look her in the face. The children crossed the street when she passed. One store clerk swore she paid with coins blackened like they'd come out of fire. A mail carrier said her house smelled of burned vinegar and something not meant for the living. Then came a storm, a hard freeze like no one had seen in years. Snow piled up against doors. Trees cracked in the cold. The roads to the ridge vanished under ice. For weeks, the valley was cut off. The sheriff couldn't reach her even if he'd wanted to. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe it was warning. When the thaw came, the men went out to cut wood and check the trails. That's when the smell hit them, foul and sweet, drifting from the creek below the Durnall cabin. They followed it down through the mud and found bones tangled in the roots, small and pale, wrapped in cloth. They ran to town, breathless, mud to their knees. "It's time," the sheriff said when he heard. "We ride at dawn." That night, nobody slept. Men sat at kitchen tables with lamps burning low, wives whispering prayers. The wind rattled the shutters, and the dogs howled without reason. When the sun rose, a pale mist curled over the ridge, thin, silver, and silent. And for the first time in months, even the birds didn't sing. Folks said later that morning felt like the hills were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to crawl out of the earth. The morning of March 6th, 1895, broke gray and cold over Madison County. The fog hung low in the hollows, and the air bit like steel. 6 riders waited at the edge of town, hats pulled low, breath clouding in the chill. Sheriff Harlan Boyd sat tall in the saddle, jaw set, eyes fixed on the ridge ahead. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Every man there knew what they were riding toward. The trail wound steep and narrow. The forest was still, too still, the only sounds the creak of saddles and the muffled thud of hooves in frozen mud. As they neared the ridge, someone pointed. A thin column of smoke was rising through the trees. "She's burning brush early," one man muttered. "That ain't brush," said the blacksmith quietly. When they reached the clearing, the sight stopped them cold. Eliza Durnall's cabin was on fire. Flames clawed through the roof, bright and wild against the gray sky. The windows glowed orange like eyes. The air was thick with the crackle of burning wood and something else, a sharp, bitter smell that made the stomach turn. "Anybody inside?" The preacher shouted. "Can't tell," the sheriff yelled back. "Grab water." They formed a line from the creek, passing buckets till their arms ached. But the fire roared louder, eating through the timbers faster than they could fight it. Sparks burst into the air like angry stars. The heat drove them back. "She's gone," the blacksmith said finally, lowering his bucket. "Ain't no salve on it." The sheriff stood watching, his face pale in the firelight. "No," he said. "We'll see what's left." When the flames finally gave way to smoke, the men stepped into the ruins. The smell was almost unbearable. Not just wood and ash, but something sour like burned meat and herbs. The roof had collapsed inward. The air shimmered with heat. They pushed through the rubble, boots sinking into ash. The preacher knelt near the hearth. "Lord," he whispered, "have mercy." Because there, under the charred boards, they saw bones. Small at first, too small. A child's bones, wrapped in a scorched quilt, half buried in the dirt. One of the farmers turned away and vomited. The sheriff went still. He knelt beside the blanket, brushed away ash with his glove, and found another, then another. Behind the hearth, beneath the collapsed floorboards, the earth was full of them. Rings, buttons, bits of fabric, a child's shoe, a woman's comb. The blacksmith whispered, "Sweet Jesus." "Keep digging," the sheriff said, his voice hoarse. "Don't stop till we know." They worked till sunset. Every shovelful brought something new. A hand, a jawbone, pieces of clothing that still clung to the dirt. No one spoke much after that. The fire had burned away the wood, but not the truth. By nightfall, the snow around the cabin was streaked black with ash. The preacher stood by, reading quietly from his Bible. "The earth shall disclose her blood." They built a small fence around the site, too numb to count the bodies. The sheriff wiped his hands on the snow, staring at the black pit where the cabin had stood. "We're not done," he said. "There's something under here." And he was right. Near what was once the hearth, one of the men found a square of wood that sounded hollow when struck. A trapdoor, small, iron-latched, half-burned. The sheriff broke it open with his rifle, but the air that came out was foul, thick, wet, and heavy with decay. He lowered a lantern. The light flickered over a cellar lined with shelves. And on those shelves, glass jars. Dozens of them. Inside, each one floated something pale, curled, and unspeakable. "Lord, save us," the preacher murmured. The sheriff climbed down, gagging on the smell. The floor was damp earth. A wooden table stood against the wall, half-burned but still holding something wrapped in linen. He pulled it open with shaking hands. It was a human hand, clean at the wrist, the skin gray as candle wax. A ring still gleamed on the finger. "That's Redding's," the blacksmith whispered. "That's the drifter's ring." The sheriff said nothing. He just stared. Then he dropped the lantern. The light guttered out, plunging the cellar into darkness. When they climbed back into the night, the air outside felt thin, like the world had shrunk around them. Not one man dared look back. They buried what they could identify in one grave. No names, no markers, just a wooden cross made from the cabin's beams. The preacher prayed until his voice gave out. The sheriff ordered a guard to watch the site. But the next morning, the guard rode into town white as a ghost. "Something's moving out there," he stammered. "Something with a light." The sheriff returned that afternoon. The ashes were cold. No footprints, no tracks, but the wooden cross they'd planted over the grave was gone. After that, nobody stayed past dusk. Even the sheriff didn't. Word spread fast. By week's end, papers in Fayetteville and St. Louis were running headlines about the witch of Madison County. Reporters came with cameras and sketchbooks, poking through what was left of the cabin. They wrote stories about witchcraft, insanity, dark medicine, anything that would sell papers. But the people who lived there didn't argue. They just shook their heads and said, "The hills keep their own." Within a month, the place was empty again. The ground softened with spring rain, and wildflowers started growing through the ashes. But people swore the soil never looked right, too dark, too damp, even in sunshine. Sheriff Boyd resigned a year later, moved north to live with his sister. Folks said he never talked about that day again. But when his diary was found years later, there was one line written clear as day. "We dug up what she buried, but something still lies beneath." For weeks after the fire, the valley never truly slept. The smoke had cleared, but a different kind of haze hung over Madison County, the kind made from shock and guilt. Folks whispered that the hills were holding their breath. Sheriff Harlan Boyd and a handful of deputies stayed on the ridge, picking through what was left of Eliza Durnall's cabin. The snow had turned to mud, and every time their shovels struck the ground, a sour smell came up from the earth. They cataloged what they could, but no one wanted to count the bones out loud. Word spread fast. Within days, strangers rode in from Fayetteville. 2 deputies, a coroner, and a reporter with ink on his fingers and big city shoes that weren't made from mountain mud. They took photographs, sketched the ruins, asked questions no one wanted to answer. The coroner wrote his report in a tight hand. 6 adult skeletons, 3 small, numerous partial remains. Case unresolved. Then he left, and the valley was quiet again. The sheriff wrote letters to nearby towns, asking about missing persons, Clara Tinsley, Thomas Redding, the peddler, the preacher's niece. Some families replied. Most didn't. Out here, people disappeared all the time, and the world rarely noticed. When the newspaper stories hit St. Louis, they gave her a name the locals never had, the Witch of Madison County. Reporters printed every rumor they could find, that she sold charms, brewed love potions, or used children's bones in her medicine. None of it was proven, but the truth didn't matter anymore. Fear sells better than facts, and the people down in the cities wanted to be frightened. A few curious travelers came up the ridge that spring, hoping to see the place for themselves. They took souvenirs, bits of scorched wood, a nail, a handful of soil. Some left things behind, coins, dried flowers, little crosses made of twigs. A woman from Little Rock fainted when she swore she heard crying from the ground. The townsfolk hated the attention. They wanted their quiet back. But quiet doesn't come easy after you've seen what they saw. The creek below the cabin ran dark for weeks, like the land itself was trying to wash something away. No grass grew there that summer. Not a single bird built a nest near the ridge. The preacher held a memorial for the nameless. He read from the book of Job and tried to comfort the families. Some wept, some just stared at the floor. When he nailed a cross to a sycamore near the site, lightning split the tree a week later. After that, no one tried to bless that ground again. By autumn, the reporters were gone, and the townspeople stopped talking about it out loud. But the story wouldn't die. Every time the wind moaned through the hollows, someone would say, "She's still up there." Then, in 1911, a logging crew clearing the ridge unearthed something else. 3 small glass jars buried near the old well. Whatever was inside had dissolved into cloudy liquid, but the men said they could see shapes. They left their tools, walked down the mountain, and never came back. The company shut down the site the next day. From then on, maps stopped marking the Durnall property. The road leading up to it grew over with vines and moss. People forgot where the trail even started. And yet, the story lingered, passed from parent to child, softened by time, twisted by fear. Some said Eliza was a murderer. Others called her a victim of madness or loneliness. A few still whispered that she wasn't human at all, that she was something older, something the hills themselves had called up and then tried to bury again. Whatever the truth was, the valley carried it in silence. The people learned not to ask questions about what the land chose to remember. And even now, more than 100 years later, when locals tell her story by the fire, they always end it the same way, with a quiet nod toward the ridge and a single line. The earth keeps what it's given, and it never gives it back. As the years passed, the story of Eliza Durnell slipped from newspapers into whispers, from history into haunting. By the early 1900s, the cabin was gone, swallowed by weeds and time. But every now and then, someone would wander too close and come back changed. The first was a trapper named Henry Cobb. He'd been camping near the old ridge in 1903, setting his traps by the White River. That night, he woke to the sound of humming, soft, slow, like a lullaby drifting through fog. He swore it came from the earth itself. When he lit his lantern, he found footprints circling his camp. Bare feet, small ones. They led nowhere. He packed his things before sunrise and never trapped that ridge again. A few years later, two brothers from Huntsville went hunting squirrels up that way. They found an old silver hairpin in the dirt, the kind women wore in the 1890s, and pocketed it as a joke, a souvenir from the witch's place, they called it. That night, both woke screaming. They told their mother they'd seen a woman standing by their beds, her face pale, her hands outstretched, whispering, "Give it back." Their mother threw the pin into the stove before sunrise. The flames turned blue, and the fire hissed like rain on iron. Over the years, stories piled up. Hunters said they'd hear knocking under the ground near the creek. Travelers claimed to see a lantern moving through the trees when there was no wind, no sound, just light, drifting slow, almost gentle. Kids dared each other to walk the ridge after dark. None of them ever made it past midnight. The ones who tried came back pale, silent, and shaking, like they'd seen something they couldn't explain. In 1917, a mail carrier named Silas Breen had the last known encounter. He was caught in a snowstorm and lost his horse near Widow's Hollow. That's what folks were calling the place by then. He said he saw a light ahead, thought it was a cabin. He followed it, shouting for help. The light stopped, then it began to move toward him. When it got close enough, he realized it wasn't a lantern at all. It was a hand. A woman's hand, holding fire that didn't burn. He fainted, woke by his horse the next morning, half frozen and too afraid to look back. He quit the route that spring. After that, folks stopped going near Widow's Hollow altogether. Hunters avoided it. Loggers refused to cut the trees around it. They said their saws dulled faster there, like the earth didn't want to be disturbed. Some believed it was guilt haunting the land, that the valley itself couldn't forget what had happened. Others said it was Eliza, still tending to the souls she'd buried, still walking between worlds, searching for what she'd lost. When a survey team came through in the 1930s, they found the old plot still listed in an old ledger, property of E. Durnell, burned 1895. One of the surveyors, a young woman, wrote a note in the margin. The site feels watched. Heard weeping by the creek at dusk. That was the last time anyone recorded the place on paper. These days, you won't find Widow's Hollow on any map. The forest took it back long ago. But on still nights, when the fog rolls low and the wind moves slow through the trees, some locals still claim they've seen a faint glow moving between the sycamores. A single light, swaying gently, as if someone's walking home. They say it's Eliza, the midwife who brought life and took it away, still watching over what the earth refused to hide. And if you stand quiet long enough, the old folks swear you can hear her voice rise from the hollow, soft as a sigh. The hills keep what they're owed. Stories like this one don't fade easily. The years might pass, the trees might grow back, but the land always remembers. The tale of Eliza Durnell, the midwife of Madison County, isn't just about darkness. It's about loneliness. It's about what happens when a person drifts too far from the world and no one reaches in to pull them back. Out here, back then, life was hard. Neighbors depended on each other, not out of kindness, but because they had to. A single midwife, a single blacksmith, a single preacher, they were the lifelines that held a whole community together. And when one of those lines broke, it left a tear that never healed. Maybe Eliza was evil. Maybe she was lost. Maybe grief and isolation turned her heart cold in ways no one could understand. We'll never really know. The records are gone. The cabin's gone. All that's left are a few words carved into local memory, and the hush that still settles over those hills when the wind turns. But her story reminds us that behind every ghost tale, there's something human, some hurt, some need, some emptiness that never found peace. When you walk through the Ozarks today, the trees stand taller, the creeks run clear. But the air there still feels old, like it's listening, like it knows. And maybe, just maybe, when the night's quiet enough, that same wind carries a lullaby across Widow's Hollow. One that sounds almost kind. Because in the Ozarks, folks still say, the earth remembers what people try to forget. If stories like this move you, subscribe to keep these lost corners of American history alive. And tell me, would you dare to visit Widow's Hollow after dark?